This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air. Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. Today's episode is going to be personal, but also, you know how everything is political around here, so we will be getting a little bit political, a little bit analytical with it, but I really wanted to start with something that is deeply personal to everyone, and particularly to me in this current phase in my life, and today we're going to talk about language and language loss specifically. Something that has been on my mind quite heavy as of late. So I am in an interesting position where I can understand my mother tongue, which is of Somali. I'm from Somalia, but I cannot speak it. I can, if someone talks to me, I can understand it perfectly fine, but when it comes time to responding, it's really hard for me to synthesize a sentence at all. All of a sudden my mind goes blank. I don't know, vocabulary to stitch together. I don't have a real grip on grammar as well. And so I feel the rare times that I am able to, put a sentence together, it's in the wrong tense. It's like when little ones begin to speak and verbalize. That's very much how I feel. So it's very clumsy in my mouth, and it feels really weird to say that out loud. It definitely is slightly uncomfortable, and it was something that I used to be very ashamed of growing up. I think now that I'm older, I'm really trying to give myself the grace here, and hopefully this year will be the year that I really get into learning Somali. But it does, even now it still feels slightly uncomfortable saying that out loud. It's like this weird just thing that's hovering over me. And while I'm, talking about this, I just want to say that there's no one to blame for being put in this position. It happens. Language loss, especially among the diaspora, is very real, and it happens. And I think even more of a reason why I wanted to record this episode, because it does happen. There's a lot to unpack around it, and I really hope to get into the many layers of this kōrero on this episode today, because it is a nuanced conversation you can come at it from a lot of angles. So this episode is not going to be a simple episode of, language loss is sad and I'm feeling lost, because yes, that is valid, but I feel like there is already so many mediums that have kind of spoken to that pain, but I really want to get and come at it from all of the angles that it's coming in. So to start with me personally, I wasn't born here in Aotearoa. I was born in Yemen, but I came here when I was 2 years old. And when I say I came here, my amazing parents migrated here with not a lot, but with a lot of hope and dreams that this Aotearoa would be home for us and be a place where we could get all the opportunities that were offered to us. And I will forever be grateful for my parents for making that choice. I can't even imagine what my life would be like if it wasn't here in Aotearoa. So I'm really, really grateful for that. And they came over at a time where it was still relatively new for the Somali community to be here in Aotearoa. And I think there was a lot of valid fear and concerns about how we would do well here, how would we thrive, how especially, one of the main priorities for my parents coming here was for education, for all of us kids to get an education. And education here is all taught, assessed in English, and they really wanted us to do well, and so the focus was really to speak English the best that we can, because even from the get-go, it just kind of felt like we were late to the start gun, if that makes sense. And so wanting to do the best that we could at school became really, really important. And a byproduct of that was not being able to really speak Af Somali, but it is, a language that my parents would speak to us at home. And so, we were able to understand it, but just never really got to the point where we were able to really develop that skill of being able to talk back in Af Somali. And it didn't seem like growing up when I was younger, I didn't really feel the weight of that. But as I've gotten older, especially I would say in the past, particularly so in the past 5 years, the weight of not being able to speak Af Somali, I've really, really felt that. Especially as I'm getting older, and I'm really wanting to get to know my family more. I'm wanting to be able to access the culture in another way, because language is, and we'll get into it into this episode, language is really important in any culture. I just want to put that out there before I get into this. But in the Somali culture, language is so important. It is so, so important. It's, in our culture, there's a lot of oral traditions. That is how histories and stories and things are really passed down generation to generation. And I feel like, I think there's a reason why they say Somali is like a land of poets, because the language is just so rich, and even a very simple, mundane thing can become a poem in itself, the way that we talk in my culture. And so, tapping into the language is so important, and there's a lot of pride as well in the language as well. And so language becomes even more important in that sense. And it's interesting, there's the Somali diaspora is huge, and across the world. And even then, like, the expectation, it doesn't matter, like, if you are a Somali kid that grew up here in Aotearoa or in America or the UK or Australia, there's this universal sense of, like, pride in the language. And being able to speak the language is really, 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 really important. And so not being able to respond back, and us Somali not being able to really speak the language, it does cut off access to particular things. And that's not to say that I don't feel Somali or I don't feel connected to culture, but it's to say that there are certain doors that are not open for me, and I know that I am, and on the other side of that door there's so much richness and connection that I'm really yearning for, and it's not accessible to me right now. And it's a really strange experience. And so, if you're a diaspora kid listening, you might know, this exact weight or this exact pain. It's really, really strange. Because, and I can only really speak for myself, but for me, Af Somali, it feels like something that belonged to me in a previous version of my life, but I would very much love for it to be alive in my life, and I want it to be alive to the point where it's something that I can then pass on to my kids. And I think, for someone who is, both my parents are from Somalia, you look at me and I'm very, very Somali. And so there is this access to culture and belonging that I have by merit of that. And, these hypothetical future kids of mine, they will be half Somali. And I know that it will be even more difficult for them. If this is how I'm feeling, it will be even more difficult for them. So I would love to be able to pass on the language. And so it will give them access and other doors to the house that is the Somali culture. I'd love to be able to pass on the language to them so they'd be able to, unlock the back door as opposed to always having to come through the front. And so, it's a deeply personal and particular kind of pain. And it comes with, a lot of embarrassment and shame. And a lot of that I've really learned to, I've tried my best to give myself grace and to let go of that. But it's still a unique kind of pain. It's like you are, if we really run with this metaphor, you can see the party that's happening in the house, but you don't have the keys to open the door and get in. So you're just watching from the outside. And so, it is deeply personal. But this year, and I've been saying this for a really long time now, but I really want to build habit and routine and structure around this. But I really want to invest in building up my language skills and being able to talk in Af Somali. By the end of this year, even if it's not a super complicated or deep conversation, that I'm able to have in English, I would love to be able to hold a basic conversation in Somali. That would really be my goal. And I know that, when I get there, because I will get there will be some healing in there, and not only just for me, like it will ripple out to, my siblings and my parents, and it will be so beautiful when we get there, but we've got to get there. So it's a really big goal of mine to be able to work on my Somali this year, and it would just mean the world if I was able to even construct a sentence. But right now that isn't a possibility, and it is a weight that I'm feeling even more. But with this kōrero, yes, it is very, very personal. It is personal when it wasn't completely absent, that Somali wasn't completely absent, from my life growing up. It was what my parents spoke. It is what the community would speak to me. It existed, in the phone calls with relatives. But, I would always respond in English, and then, slowly English became the language of everything, the language I think in, dream in, feel emotions in, and Somali just slipped away. So it's so strange. It's like you recognize the rhythm, but you just can't fully participate. So it is something that's very deeply personal, but I also want to come at it from another lens, because when you think about it, language loss, it can also be about systems and power, migration and belonging. And I really wanted to get into that. So the first point that I really wanted to start with is language loss. It's something that has been studied by linguists and sociologists. Immigrant communities have been studied for decades, and a consistent finding is something called heritage language loss. And, just to clarify, a heritage language is a language connected to your cultural background, but not the dominant language of the society where you live. So for me personally, my heritage language is Somali, but it's not the dominant language of, where I live here in Aotearoa. And there is, among many different migrant communities, there's a clear pattern that has arisen. And, research has shown that by third generation, heritage language can decline quite dramatically. And, getting all academic, fancy-schmancy academic with it, a sociologist, sociolinguist, Joshua Fishman, made the argument that language survival really depends on intergenerational transmission. So, to keep it a buck and to keep it real, it's, if parents speak the language to their children consistently and then children use it daily, the language survives. So it's the gift of the language has really been passed on generation to generation. But it can become limited in certain contexts, like speaking with grandparents, it becomes vulnerable. And this is, I think, where the life of being a migrant, makes things harder for that, intergenerational transmission, because it survives through daily immersion, like daily use. But that's not the context that we're living in, because, and I can say this for like myself and my siblings, like most of your time is spent in spaces dominated by not your heritage language. We're thinking about school and media, workplaces, friends, online spaces, and so you can see how that would happen. But this is to say that it doesn't always happen. Research has found that language retention is stronger when there's various things happening, like large diaspora communities. The bigger the community, the bigger the chance the language will be kept alive. When there are religious institutions that use the language, so in the Somali community, we have Duksi, which I'm pretty sure it translates to school. I'm not 100% sure, so don't quote me on that. But at the mosque every weekend, there would be teachers, ma'alins, teaching the Quran, and that would be in Somali. And also you're in a space where there are other Somali kids, and so it's a lot easier to, it's a great environment for the language to Somali to be and to be heard and to be spoken. And so there was Duksi. When there are schools that teach the language specifically, when there is this intentional prioritization of language transmission. There are lots of different contexts where language retention does happen. For example, Arabic often survives longer in diaspora communities because it is tied to religious practice. Mandarin has a strong institutional support through language schools. And so, there are structural things that make it, that support that language being passed on to the next generation. But you can see how, if you zoom out, it is how it's possible for language loss to happen. Another key thing that I think is really important to talk about when we are talking about language and migration is another important factor in language loss is social mobility. People who have done research in this space have described language learning as a migration strategy. So for immigrant families, learning the dominant language as quickly as possible is essential for survival, because fluency in English was strongly tied to access to education, professional jobs, political participation, economic mobility. And so many immigrant parents make a strategic decision to prioritize the dominant language because they want their children to succeed. And that decision totally makes sense within the systems they are navigating. Language shift becomes a form of adaptation to structural realities. So what looks like, what because two things can be true at the same time. What is a cultural loss is also a strategy for survival and opportunity. And I think this is something that is, relevant to my life. And it's not like my parents ever explicitly said, like, no Somali in the house or anything like that. But they were really worried that we would miss out on things at school because of, us migrating here and not like growing up here in Aotearoa. And when I say growing up here in Aotearoa, I'm talking about like generations, like my parents made the decision for us to come here. So we are, first generation. And that is something that is heavily on their minds. And I hope that with the generations to come, we are able to heal that pain and stem that loss by being able to access the language again. And I absolutely believe it. I absolutely believe it, that we will get there, even though it will take some hard work to get there. We will. I think obviously this language loss, it is really sad. It is hard to deal with. And I think there are many names to this particular kind of pain. And one way that it's become a particular kind of pain is, when language kind of becomes a test of identity. There is something that interesting that happens when, people find out that you don't speak your own mother tongue. It feels like this weird kind of test, and this is definitely something that I've experienced many a time in my life. Where you ask the question like, oh, well, do you speak the language? And I'm not saying this happens every time, but it's happened enough. And when you say no, there's this kind of pause. It's almost like this sense of recalibration, and it's almost as if the person is like rethinking their understanding of who you are. And so now language becomes a test of authenticity and a test of your identity. And it's something that comes up, this particular kind of pain is something that comes up in diaspora storytelling. Like in the movie The Farewell, the main character, Billy, is a Chinese American woman who travels to China to visit her grandmother. And similar to me, Billy understands Mandarin but struggles to speak it fluently. And so, in the film, language becomes a symbol of her cultural distance, and so she's emotionally connected to her family but linguistically separated from them, and it's that separation that creates moments of awkwardness and vulnerability. And that's something that I really, really feel, especially when I'm wanting to connect with family or with people from the community. I understand what that separation, how that feels and what it does to you. In the show Rami, language becomes intertwined with religion and identity, and so characters who speak Arabic fluently are often seen as more culturally grounded, but on the other end of the spectrum, the American-born generation struggles to navigate what authenticity means in a Western context. In A Master of None, Aziz Ansari explores the generational divide between immigrant parents and then the American-born children, and language becomes one of the clearest markers of that divide. And, all of these stories, even though they're TV shows and movies, they do resonate because they reflect something real. And it's that sense that language, often becomes the ultimate proof of belonging. And I think the reason behind that is because language is measurable. You either speak it or you don't. But culture, however, is far more complicated than that. Culture is made up of many things. It's hard to reduce it down to components or layers. I mean, yes, you can do that to explain it, but even then it goes much deeper than that. And, so therefore it's complicated. But language, it's, it's either you speak it or you don't. And, James Baldwin once wrote that, language is meant to define the other. And in this case, the other is refusing to be defined. And so I think the thing that language can do that we can't really do with culture is that language can draw boundaries, because you can either speak it or you don't. But identity is very rarely that tidy, and the same can be said for culture. And so you can see how, in that sense, language can become the ultimate proof of belonging, when it shouldn't necessarily be. But then also at the same time, I think with this whole language thing, I'm realizing that many things can be true at the same time. Knowing the language can open doors to particular things. Like when I was watching The Farewell, it really resonated with me because, Billy so connected in with her family, and there's this deep sense of love there. But there was that separation linguistically, and it was hard to not ignore that separation. So again, this is particular kind of pain. Another particular kind of pain is that experience of almost knowing, and I think it's one of the most emotionally complicated parts of diaspora language loss, and linguists call it passive bilingualism, and it's exactly the situation that I'm in. It's, describes people like me who can understand a language but struggle to speak it fluently. And, this often happens when children hear a language at home but really need to actively use it. And so, over time, comprehension develops, but without that ability to produce the language. And so, you can follow conversations, but when it's your turn to speak, the words did not come easily. And so emotionally, passive bilingualism, it just feels like something else entirely, because you feel like you're almost belonging, but you're not quite fully in, but you're not completely disconnected as well. And what makes that even harder is that you are close enough to really feel what you're missing. And there's grief really attached to that. And it's something that I had to sit with all my life. And as I get older, this grief just gets stronger and stronger. So there's a particular kind of pain to almost knowing. Also, another layer of pain to this is, and it's something that's been captured in research as well, is the emotional translation gap. So parents usually learn emotional vocabulary in their first language, but the children will learn emotional vocabulary in the dominant language of, where they're growing up. And so when parents and children try to have vulnerable conversations, you're navigating two different emotional languages, and, emotions don't translate well. Even if you're talking to someone who speaks the exact same language as you, when you're having a vulnerable conversation, it's still, really hard to fully understand each other. And so to do that in two different languages, it makes it even harder, because there are certain Somali words that carry cultural meaning that just doesn't, there's no direct translational word for it in English. And so it just creates this friction. It makes it harder. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but it makes it harder to understand each other. And it's because that emotional vocabulary doesn't line up. And Bell Hooks wrote something really beautiful about language, and she described language as a place of struggle, but also a place of possibility. So, language shapes how we express love and anger, vulnerability and care. And so, when families operate across multiple languages, those emotional expressions can be, they can become complicated. And so I'm really resonating with what Bell Hooks said, saying it's a place of struggle, but also a place of possibility. And this emotional translation gap is also another point of pain. And I hope that, if you're a diaspora kid who's also in the same position that I'm in, this is really speaking to you. Now, this is where we're going to get a little bit political, because, yes, there's personal stories and personal pain wrapped up in language and language loss. But I also wanted to take a step back and think about it from a political, systemic point of view, because there are certain languages that dominate globally, and there is a global hierarchy of languages. And to understand why there is that global hierarchy, we have to talk about colonialism, because European empires spread their languages through education, government institutions, and trade networks. And so over time, languages like English, French, and Spanish became associated with that power and that opportunity. And if you think back to, look at what's happening here in Aotearoa, the decline of Te Reo Māori is a really powerful example of that, because during the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were so many colonial education policies that actively discouraged Māori children from speaking their language, and many were punished, physically punished in schools for using te reo. For example, we had the Native Schools Act in 1867, which established government control, I'm using air quotes, you can't see me, native schools for Māori communities that required English to be the language of instruction, and schools only received funding if teaching was done in English. And so teachers actively discouraged or punished students for speaking te reo. And many Māori children were beaten, strapped, or shamed for using their language. And so this piece of legislation was the foundation for English-only education system for Māori children. And then there's the Education Act in 1877, which standardized, English curriculum and reinforced the English-only teaching model. And so, while there's in that piece of legislation, there isn't any explicit mention of banning te reo, the system created institutionalized English dominance in education. And so, by the mid-20th century, the number of fluent speakers had dramatically declined. But, since the 1980s, there has, been powerful revitalization efforts, kohanga reo, kura kaupapa Māori, and language movements have really helped revive the language, but there's still a really, really long way to go. And I think the reason why I bring this up is that, yes, language loss is personal, and there is a particular kind of pain and grief to that, but history always reminds us that language loss is often not accidental as well. It's really shaped by policy, power, and systems. And there's a Kenyan writer, Thiongo, who wrote this book called Decolonizing the Mind, and has extensively written about the politics of language. And in the book, he made a argument that language is one of the most powerful tools of cultural control. He wrote, language carries culture, and culture carries the entire body of values by which we come to perceive ourselves and our place in the world. And so when languages disappear, entire worldviews risk disappearing with them. And so it's not just about the language here. So much of language is attached to culture. And again, I want to reiterate that culture is very complicated, and it cannot be condensed to language. But with every aspect of culture, and every manifestation of culture, it carries values in which we perceive ourselves and our place in the world. And language is one avenue for culture to be carried. And so when language is suppressed, you can see how worldviews are at risk of disappearing with them. And that also becomes a particular kind of pain. Then we have cultural gatekeeping, and this is a particular kind of pain as well. Diaspora kids who don't speak their heritage language often face cultural gatekeeping. You're not really one of us if you don't speak the language. And no one has actually ever directly said that to me before, but it is a vibe that I have picked up. And it's a shame because identity isn't purely about language. Identity is historical, it's relational, it's emotional, and diaspora kids can sometimes get to know the migration stories, the history and the cultural traditions deeply, but language becomes the easiest way to judge that authenticity. So there's sometimes a sense of cultural gatekeeping that happens, which is a shame because I truly believe that cultural memory can exist beyond language. It doesn't only live in words. It lives in sensory memory, in food, in music, in rituals, in the smell of certain dishes cooking, in the rhythm of family gatherings. And so, your body can remember culture even when the language fades. And I think that's something that has been hugely powerful for me to realize in my personal sphere. I think especially growing up, it just didn't really feel like I was fully Somali, or I felt like I couldn't really claim that because I didn't really know the language. And, I still don't know the language now, but I have come to realize that identity and culture is very complicated. You cannot condense it down. You cannot condense it down to just language. And I still feel very connected to Somali, to my people and to my culture. It's in the music, it's in the food, it's in the shah that we make, it's in my favorite dishes. And when I smell the smell of like hawash, I feel connected. When I'm wearing my bati around the house, I'm feeling connected. When I am carrying the values of what it means to be Somali and living that, for example, family and community is so important to my culture and the way that I, relate to my parents and my siblings. It's a manifestation of that value. And so I 100% agree that your body and your heart can remember and embody culture even when that language has faded. And I think it's just really important to bring that up. One thing that I have noticed, especially now that, I know some words here and there, and so there's this weird hybrid language and linguistic blend between Somali and English that has come through. It's this hybrid slang, this code switching that is happening here. And I think, there is a sense of creativity that is happening. And, some languages that exist today in this world have come from, creating new languages or putting languages together. And so it's really interesting, especially now that I'm not just talking about the Somali community here. There is a huge group of diaspora kids across the country and the world, and also as we see more mixing of cultures among these families, there's going to be even more hybrid slang or languages created. So that is really, really interesting. Really interesting to me. And I think it gets to this point that culture is, yes, one facet of it is language. One where if you don't speak it or you don't have access to that language, you can see, there are particular pains that come with that, and there are gaps there. But culture is bigger than just language. There's more to it, and also it's really easy to think of culture and think, oh well, it's something that is fixed and is rigid. But culture evolves all the time. Culture is always evolving. I think one word that's used a lot when culture is mentioned or spoken about is traditional or traditions. And culture, and when you use that word tradition, the connotation with that is that it is set in stone and it is concrete. And culture isn't necessarily like that. Yes, the arms of how that culture is experienced, it may be a bit more rigid, but the roots of that culture, the roots are always growing, always changing over time. But because it's happening, constantly, it's not that change isn't always being acutely felt or experienced. There isn't this awareness. It's kind of just happening. How, you might be aware of your muscles shredding and growing if you're going to the gym, but you don't always necessarily notice the things that happen in the background without you having to think about it, like your heart beating and breathing. But it's the same with culture. Those roots are always growing and changing and adapting. And so I'm curious, what culture is going to look like and be like in, say, 10, 20, 30 years' time. But I think because culture has always kind of been viewed as this traditional thing. We forget that it does change. So yeah, I'm really curious how it will grow, especially when it comes to language. But I really wanted to, take this time, get a little bit personal with it, but also a little bit political with it, to talk about language and what is the cost of language loss. And it's taken me a lot of work and a lot of learning and unlearning to get to the point where I can say that, yes, I am a proud Somali woman, and I do feel connected to culture, even though I don't speak the language. But also there is a particular kind of pain and grief that comes with that, not being able to know the language. And on many levels, not just like this is sad and this is hard. It comes in many forms and layers. And multiple things can be true in that sense. But I hope that your takeaway from this episode is, if you're a fellow diasporic in the same position as me, hopefully I've been able to put some words to your experience. But also, language is really complicated, and so is culture. And I think it's something that we'll have to constantly be open and honest about with ourselves and with our loved ones around us about culture and how you experience it and how you embody it. And, whatever position you're in with your language, I hope you can let go of that shame and give yourself grace and forgiveness, because it is so personal. Thank you for tuning into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns, and we'll catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.